click record. We are now recording. So I'm very excited to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Oh, before I do, just a little bit of housekeeping. I should have done this a little bit sooner. My apologies. First, we will ask that you will keep yourselves muted throughout the talk. That just helps with the speaker and the flow of tonight's talk. If you have any questions, we're going to encourage you to use the chat function. So if you hover towards the bottom, you should see somewhere a bubble saying chat. Bring that up, type out any questions that you might have as we go along, and then we'll be sure to address them at the end. We've been doing it like this since probably we started this back in September. It's a system that works for us, and we really do appreciate your assistance in keeping this going. So yes, tonight's guest speaker is my coworker, Jennifer Weymark. Jennifer has been with the Oshawa Museum since 1999 and has been in the role of archivist since 2000. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Good evening, everyone. As Lisa said, I have been in the position of archivist for the past 20 some odd years. One of the best parts of my job is being able to expand the stories that we're telling. I like to call it changing the narrative. So we're starting to look at Oshawa's history through slightly different lenses. And this talk tonight is all about looking at history through that slightly different lens. And I'm just going to get my slideshow started. So today we're going to look at the history of slavery in Canada, and we are going to look at it from an Oshawa perspective. Now, when we think about slavery, the tendency is to picture those large southern plantations, expansive cotton fields, and hundreds of people treated as property due to the color of their skin. While this is certainly true in the context of the southern United States, this is not how slavery looked here in Canada. While slavery looked different in Canada, it is still very much a part of the history of this nation. Slavery, in what we now know as Canada, actually predates the arrival of Europeans. The arrival of Europeans brought a new type of slavery to this land, one that saw enslaved people as property, one that was based on race and the idea that those who were not white were lesser. This presentation is by no means an exhaustive look at the long history of slavery and racism in Canada. It will provide an overview of the history of chattel slavery here in Canada as it relates to the Black population. Enslavement of Indigenous peoples by colonizing nations is also an important part of our country's history. In fact, at the peak of slavery in New France, out of approximately 4,200 slaves, 2,700 of those slaves were Indigenous people, and at least 1,450 were Black enslaved. Now, in early Canada, the enslavement of African peoples was a legal instrument. It was designed to expand the colonial economy. African slavery existed in the colonies of New France and British North America for well over 200 years. Yet there remains a profound silence in our historical teachings about Canada's involvement in the African slave trade. According to available historical documents, at least 4,000 Africans were held in bondage for 2 centuries in the early colonial settlements of New France, today Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Upper Canada, today Ontario. The earliest written evidence of enslaved Africans in New France is the recorded sale of a boy from either Madagascar or Guinea. This boy was believed to be at least 6 years old. In 1629, the boy was brought to New France by the Kirk brothers, who were British traders. The boy was first sold to a French clerk by the name of Olivier Le Bailiff. who was also known as Olivier le Tardif. In 1633, this young enslaved boy was baptized and given the name Olivier le Jeune. According to Natasha Henry, an educator, historian, and curriculum consultant, in Canada, quote, Black slaves were used to meet the demand of a developing new colony. They worked in towns and cities, not only as domestic servants, but also as fur traders, miners, fishermen, wharf workers, and sailors. African slaves also worked in skilled jobs such as blacksmith, carpenters, wheelwrights, and coopers. They cleared and farmed land. They toiled in hotels, taverns, and other businesses. Their coerced labor brought economic benefits to this country and helped to meet the needs of their local communities. Canada is further connected to the transatlantic slave trade through the trading of products like timber and salted cod with slave-holding Caribbean colonies for slave-produced goods such as rum, molasses, tobacco, and sugar. Enslaved Africans were bought and sold through newspapers and at public auctions. Slaves were bequeathed in wills, passed down to family members along with furniture and farm animals. They were held by government officials, clergy, merchants, natives, and United Empire loyalists. Like their American counterparts, Canadian slaves faced inhumane treatment and were subject to whippings, jail sentences, and hangings at the gallows. To resist their conditions, many slaves fled to the free territories of the northern US in pursuit of their liberty. End quote. Clearly, Canada was not the beacon of hope for Blacks that we have been taught. Oshawa has at least one recorded slave owner associated with its history. In the early 1800s, an Oshawa landowner left his property to his slaves upon his death. Sir Robert Isaac de Grey's family fled the United States at the start of the American Revolution. The family was prominent, and Grey made use of his family's position to become a lawyer and eventually held a seat in the House of Assembly of Upper Canada. When the family arrived in Quebec, they brought with them their slave, Dorinda Baker. Shortly after the Grey family moved to Cornwall, Upper Canada, Dorinda met and married Jacob Baker, a free white man. Together, they had two sons, Simon and John, and two daughters, Elizabeth and Bridget. Simon and John were born during the time that the law stated that all children born to one slave parent, most likely a mother, were born into slavery themselves, while their sisters were born after the law change and thus were born free. After arriving in the Canadas, Grey purchased the elderly matriarch of the family, Levine, and brought her to serve with the rest of the family. In his will, de Grey left his property in Oshawa to John and Simon. Sadly, Simon died along with Grey in the shipwreck of the Speedy in October of 1804. In his will, it is stated that his slaves were granted freedom upon his death. To Simon, he left 200 acres of Lot 11 in the second concession, as well as his clothes and a watch worth 50 pounds. To John, he left 200 acres of Lot 17 in the first concession, along with 50 pounds. After Grey's death, John was released from slavery and began to work for Justice William Dummer Powell. After enlisting in the army, he went to New Brunswick and fought in the War of 1812. He eventually settled in Cornwall, Ontario, until his death in 1871. At the time of his death, it was said that he was the last surviving person who had been enslaved in Upper Canada. The Baker family can be traced to a gentleman by the name of Cato Prime. Prime was born in Guinea, Africa. Nothing is known of his life in Africa. He was most likely born between 1710 and 1720, taken and sold into slavery in Newark, New Jersey between 1725 and 1735. During the 1700s, when the transatlantic slave trade was flourishing, West Africans accounted for approximately 2/3 of the African captives imported into the Americas. We do not know the exact circumstances that led to Prime being sold into slavery, but it may have resembled an account documented by Odalu Ikuanu. Ikuanu is an African author who is also known as Gustav Vasa, who wrote about the day his sister and he were abducted from their home in his autobiography. The name of the autobiography is The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Odalu Ikuanu. Ikuanu was just 8 years old when he was abducted from his home. In 1766, he was able to purchase his freedom and write about those experiences. This quote is from his book. Quote, "One day, when all our people were gone out to do their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both, and, without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could, till night come on, and we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep." End quote. It sometimes took several months to transport captives to the coast, and they were often sold and resold to several new owners along the way. Once they reached the coast, some captives were taken to slave forts or compounds where they waited for a slave vessel to arrive. Once a ship was ready, the Africans were handed over to their new captors, Europeans or Americans, who would take them on their journey to the Americas. Prime was transported to New Jersey, where he was purchased by John Lowe between 1725 and 1735. At some point after arriving in New Jersey, Prime became a father when his daughter Levine was born, most likely prior to 1740. At this time, there is no information on who Levine's mother was. Around 1759, Levine herself had a daughter who was named Dorin or Dorinda. Given that they were both born while Prime was enslaved by Lowe, both Levine and Dorin belonged to the Lowe family. When Lowe's daughter, Elizabeth, married a Captain John Gray, the couple were given Dorin as a wedding gift. Dorin traveled with the family when they moved from New Jersey to Montreal. The Grays resided in Montreal from 1776 to 1784, when they moved to Grays Creek area, just east of Cornwall, that was named after that family. It was after this move that Dorin met and married Jacob Baker. Baker's history is unclear. In an interview with the Toronto newspaper in 1869, John Baker, Dorin's son, says that his father was a Dutchman. However, in his book on the history of Osgoode Hall, author James Hamilton states that Baker was a German Hessian who served with the British Army during the American Revolution. Either way, Baker was a free man while Dorin remained enslaved by the Gray family. According to Jacob Farrand Pringle, author of a book examining the history of the Lunenburg area, the Bakers had a large family. The eldest children, Simon and John, were born enslaved, as the law at the time stated, that the children inherited the status of their mother. And the 2 daughters born, Elizabeth and Bridget, were born free because the laws had changed prior to their birth. Upon the death of John Gray, Dorin and her sons became the property of Robert Isaac de Grey, the son of Elizabeth and John. In that interview with the Toronto newspaper, that is highlighted in Pringle's book, Baker recounted his life with the Gray family. Referring to John Gray as Colonel, Baker spoke of how strict his master was. Quote, "The Colonel had much property. He was strict and sharp, made us wear deerskin shirts and deerskin jackets, and gave us many a flogging. At these times he would pull off my jacket, and the raw hide would fly around my shoulders very fast." Son Robert took Simon with him to act as his body servant when he left Cornwall to practice law in York. It was during this time that the younger Gray became the first Solicitor General of Upper Canada. In August 1796, Elizabeth Gray, wife of John, was granted 600 acres of property in Whitby Township. It is this property that connects the Baker brothers and Gray to Oshawa. Robert Isaac de Grey, Elizabeth's son, and Simon Baker died when the ship they were traveling on, the Speedy, wrecked near Presqu'île Point in Brighton Township. In his will, Gray finally granted the Baker family their freedom. Gray not only granted freedom to Doreen and her family, but he did make provisions for her future. The will stipulated that £1,200 from his real estate holdings be put into a fund for Doreen, and that the interest be given to her annually. He also left provisions in his will for Simon and John. As mentioned previously, to Simon, he left 200 acres of Lot 11 in the second concession, as well as his clothing and a watch worth £50. And to John, he left 200 acres of Lot 17 in the first concession, along with £50. Land registry documents do show us the property that was left to John. It was finally transferred to him on June 12, 1824. However, John did not keep the property long, as records indicate that the lot was sold to Martin Sanford on June 14, 1824. The records are difficult to read, and it is unclear how much money John sold the lot for. According to Baker, in his interview with that Toronto newspaper, quote, "At the time of Mr. Gray's death, slavery was still in existence in Upper Canada. The Statute 33, Chapter 7, passed on the 9th of July, 1793, prohibited the importation of slaves. It did not liberate any Negro then in the state of slavery, but provided for the emancipation of children of slaves on reaching the age of 25 years." End quote. This is important to note. While one could not import any new slaves, one did not have to liberate those already enslaved. John Baker's interview with the newspaper gives us a glimpse into his life as a free man. After Gray's death released Baker from slavery, he began to work for Justice William Dummer Powell. Interestingly, Powell has a connection with the Henry family, as Thomas Henry was employed by the judge at the start of 1812, the War of 1812. While with Powell, Baker enlisted with the army and went to New Brunswick, fighting in the War of 1812. According to Baker, he was with his regiment during battles at Lundy's Lane, Fort Erie, and Sackett's Harbor. It appears that Baker was also in the military until after the Battle of Waterloo, where he apparently saw Napoleon and was not particularly impressed. From his interview with that Toronto newspaper, quote, "I saw Napoleon. He was a chunky little fellow. He rode hard and jumped ditches." End quote. Once his time in the military ended, Baker returned to Canada and settled back in Cornwall. He worked in the area until age caught up with him. Around 1861, he received a pension from the British government for his time in the military. John Baker died on January 18th, 1871. At the time of his death, Baker was believed to have been the last person held in slavery in Canada. What became of Cato and his daughter Levine? Pringle provides us with a glimpse into their lives after Doreen left with the Greys. According to Pringle, the younger Grey, or Sir Robert Isaac de Grey, traveled to Albany in the winter of 1803. He wrote about his travels in a letter to his cousin, Catherine Valentine. In this letter, he wrote about seeing Levine, Doreen's mother. At this time, Levine was living in a tavern with a man. According to Gray's letter, quote, I immediately employed a friend of mine, Mr. Ramsay of Albany, to negotiate with the man for the purchase of her. He did so, stating that I wished to buy her freedom, in consequence of which the man readily complied to give her to me for $50. When I saw her, she was overjoyed and appeared as happy as any person could be at the idea of seeing her child Doreen and her children once more, with whom, if Doreen wishes it, she will willingly spend the remainder of her days. I could not avoid doing this act. The opportunity seemed to have been thrown in my way by Providence, and I could not resist. She is a good servant yet, healthy and strong, and among you, you may find her useful. I have promised her that she may work as much or as little as she pleases while she lives. But from the character I have seen of her, idleness is not her pleasure. End quote. Levine came to Canada with Gray and was with the family of Judge Anderson, who lived near Cornwall, for the rest of her life. During his trip, Gray also saw Cato Prime. Prime was still in Newark with a Mrs. Governor. According to Gray, Prime was elderly and blind. In fact, the, quote, poor fellow came to feel me, for he could not see. He asked affectionately after the family, end quote. Presumably, Prime is buried somewhere in Newark. Many Canadians do not know that slavery existed in Canada. And this is an aspect of our history that we must work to learn more about and to understand the impact of the slavery on Canada to this day. There. Thank you. Now, if you have any questions, I am here and ready to answer.
So, okay, I am unmuted. Fantastic. So we do have one question in the chat. Does the museum have an archive or even a list of first-person publications, books, stories, or articles by Black residents of Ontario, especially from the immediate area of Oshawa?
Quick answer to that is no, we don't. That is something that I'm working on, is developing additional resources and more resources to help us better understand the impact and what slavery and what the Black Canadian experience was like in our area. The museum has begun to do a great deal of research into that. However, it is challenging in that because it was outside of kind of that traditional narrative or what we typically collected, there is not a great deal of information. Now, luckily, there's a lot of really fantastic academics who are working to begin to create these resources. And I quoted Natasha Henry, and I highly, highly recommend everyone take the opportunity to get to see and learn from items that she has written. I know right now she is working as part of her doctoral work to develop a database that will link together resources related to the Black experience in Ontario as a whole. So she has spent a great deal of time going through archival collections and gathering up the information related to the Black experience in Ontario. And when that database is completed, it is going to be just an amazing resource and something that I think will benefit everyone who is looking at to learn a bit more in a more accurate history of our province and of our country. So hopefully that answers your question. And now I see another question. Nope,
Well,
sorry.
I was just going to ask, where will that be hosted, Jen?
She hasn't said yet. She is, I believe it's York is where Ms. Henry is working to get her doctorate. So most likely it would end up there, but she is also active with a lot of other organizations. So I'm not sure. And I don't know if she knows yet where it will end up being hosted.
Interesting. Thank you.
And I see there's another question that's asking if there are any photos of John Baker or any of the other family members. No, not to my knowledge. The majority of the Baker family passed away before photography was really existent here in Canada. John did live long enough, but I don't believe there was any photos. If there are, it might be in the Cornwall area. I know he is been a topic of research for people in that area as well. And then there's another one asking if I'm familiar with Tubman's Church in St. Catharines and Richard Pearpoint. And the answer to that is yes and yes. And what's interesting to me about Harriet Tubman's Church in St. Catharines is I was there years ago for a hockey tournament. And I drove past it a couple of times and finally asked to stop and look and read the sign, because I didn't realize that that she had spent time in St. Catharines. So since that time, I have been paying attention to her church, and they just, I think it was a month ago, announced that they had received federal funding to help preserve that church. It's quite old, obviously, and was in desperate need of a great deal of restoration work. So they now have federal funding for it, and I think we'll try and share it as they share with us, kind of what's going along. So we'll share it on our social media channels. And I know about Richard Pearpoint, and we actually had a gentleman, oh gosh, I'm going to say 15, possibly more years ago, come out and speak on Richard Pearpoint here for the Historical Society. And it may have actually been closer to 19 years ago, because I'm dating myself now. But yeah, he came out and spoke on his book looking at Richard Pearpoint.
I will also add that Historica has done their Heritage Minutes, and one of them is about Richard Pearpoint, and we shared it on the museum's Twitter and Facebook page. So if you're looking for a quick 60-second who is Richard Pearpoint, search out his Heritage Minute.
And now I have another question that says, did early census data identify local residents by race and color? From the 1700s, was there any indication in the official records of persons identified as slaves? First, the earliest census records that we have, at least federal census, dates to 1851. So in that one, they do document race and ethnicity in that census, and they do throughout. It shifts each decade as to kind of what the question is and exactly what the answer may be. I speak a lot about census records in our other presentation where we're looking at early Black history in Oshawa, because that's kind of where we're pulling the information from. And what is interesting, and academics have argued this for years, is that early Black Canadians are dramatically undercounted in the census records. And we can see that in our research. So we are tracing the Andrews, Dunbar, Pankhurst family. And through those census records, the 1851 census denotes their race as Black. The 1861 census, there's nothing. The 1871 census, they're African. The 1881, they are listed as being British and Scottish. So if you don't know to trace the family through those census records, if you just looked at the 1861 and 1881, you wouldn't necessarily understand the complete picture of that family that you're looking at. Now, in terms of official records identifying slaves, I haven't come across anything across Ontario. It sounds terrible to say this. We got lucky to find out about the Baker family simply because of the wreck of the Speedy. That shipwreck was huge news at the time that it occurred. And a great number, first off, they were traveling to York related to a large murder trial. So it was a very sensational trial. When the shipwreck happened, there was a lot of high-ranking personnel on that ship. So again, there was a lot of attention being paid to it. We also got very lucky in that, unlike the vast majority of the people who were on the ship at the time, Sir Robert Isaac de Grey actually had a will. And in his will is where we learn first about Dorin and John and Simon, and the fact that they were enslaved. And this is kind of our first connection to slavery that is directly linked to Oshawa. Now, I honestly don't know if John or Simon ever stepped foot in Oshawa, if they were ever anywhere near this property that was left to them, but it was left to them. What I thought was interesting is the land registry office or records show that, the shipwreck went down in 1804, and it wasn't until 1824 that John finally gained ownership of that lot. And then literally 2 days later, he sells it. I'm curious to know why the delay in that in between the death of Sir Robert Isaac de Grey and John actually getting the land that he was left in the will. So without de Grey having his will, we may not have even known much about the the Baker family, and wouldn't necessarily know to dig deeper into them. I know that Pringle's book is an important history of the Cornwall area, so much so that Baker's story was told in there simply because, again, his age, because he lived to, if you do the numbers, it says 105. We think there might be a little exaggeration on Baker's point, but he lived a long life. So his long life, the fact that he was believed to be the very last living person that had been enslaved in Upper Canada, had a lot of reasons for his story to be documented. So hopefully that answers that question. Are there records of First Nation slavery practices in Ontario that I alluded to in your introduction? As in slavery amongst the First Nation, the First Nations? There is. It's not something that I know a great deal on, so I'm not necessarily comfortable about talking. It was here. It was part of the First Nations, but again, not something that I have done a great deal of research in, so I'm not necessarily comfortable talking on that subject. And Mr. Black is asking, have I had a chance to read Simcoe's anti-slavery law of 1792-3, where the slaves were to be set free after 25 years? No, I have not read the entirety of that law. I was interested more in Baker's perspective of it, and just kind of what it must be from his perspective to, to see this new law come in. Well, even just for his sisters, to see the law come in where they were no longer, just because their mother was enslaved, the girls were not enslaved, and then that you remained a slave until you turned 25 and suddenly you were granted freedom. So and when we say freedom, what does that mean? You were no longer property to somebody, but life was not easy. In fact, life was very, very hard. When I was reading through Natasha Henry's work, I was shocked. I'm not sure if that's the right word. I was impacted by the fact that that in Canada, we seem to see ourselves as the end of the Underground Railroad, a beacon of light, and how the reality is that life was very, very hard here for free Blacks, so hard that they would actually go back down to the northern states and hopefully find a more comfortable life there. So I thought that was really interesting and really telling and very different than the way we perceive Canadian or Canada's part in that that part of the history. So are there any other questions?
No, unless going, no. I think that was it in terms of questions. So once again, Jennifer, thank you so much for that talk. It was my first time hearing it, and I really did enjoy learning a little bit more about this local history, and it was really great to have that local perspective as well. And thank you all so much for joining us and for your thoughtful questions that you raised in the chat. Before we say goodnight, I'm just going to mention 2 events. In Jen's talk, she mentioned the research that we have undertaken and one of the other presentations that we do revolving around the Andrews Dunbar Pankhurst family. And that is going to be, we're actually hosting that as a tea and talk at the end of the month. That is taking place on Sunday, February 28th at 1 p.m. And tickets are still available for that. You can find that either on our Facebook page, or if you go to Oshawa Museum, .eventbrite.com. That's how you can find the link for registering for that event. The other event that I will mention is our next speaker series, and that is coming up on March 16th, 7 p.m. So that is the 3rd Tuesday. And we are welcoming Fred Robbins. He is the president of the York Pioneers, and he will be joining us for a talk on the history of the York Pioneers and Scadding's Cabin. So thank you once again, one and all. This talk will be available on our YouTube channel probably before the end of the week. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the museum. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay warm, and hopefully we will see you all again next month. Take care.